Welcome.
Welcome to the Everything Podcast. In this episode, I'll be recapping Ant and Dec's Limitless Win, Season 4, Episode 4, which was released on the 12th of January 2025. I'm recording this episode on the 16th of March 2025. So without further ado, here is my recap of Ant and Dec's Limitless Win, Season 4, Episode 4. Ant and Dec introduce themselves in the episode. Dec insults Ant. Dan and Sarah are introduced. Sarah explains her outfit. Dan and Sarah answer some quickfire questions. Dan and Sarah receive 30 lives. Ant and Dec explain how Limitless Win works. Ant and Dec introduce the lifelines. Dan and Sarah answer their first question. This answer is exact. Dan and Sarah bank £1,000. Dan and Sarah now have 35 lives. Dan and Sarah receive a reveal, I think is what that's meant to say, what they would use their winnings for. Dan and Sarah lock in another answer. This answer is exact. Dan and Sarah bank £5,000. Dan and Sarah now have 40 lives. Dan and Sarah receive their more than lifeline. Dan and Sarah answer another question. Dan and Sarah use their more than lifeline. This answer is under. Dan and Sarah lose 3 of their lives. Dan and Sarah lock in another answer. This answer is under. Dan and Sarah lose 4 of their lives. Dan and Sarah answer another question. This answer is exact. Dan and Sarah bank £75,000. Dan and Sarah now have 38 lives. Dan and Sarah receive their range lifeline. Dan and Sarah lock in another answer. This answer is under. Dan and Sarah lose 3 of their lives. Dan and Sarah receive their take 2 lifeline. Dan and Sarah choose to keep their take 2 lifeline. Dan and Sarah answer another question. Dan and Sarah use their take 2 lifeline. The game chooses to use Ant and Dec's answer. This answer is exact. Dan and Sarah bank £250,000. Dan and Sarah now have 40 lives. Dec reminds Sarah of the cash out button. Dan and Sarah lock in another answer. This answer is under. Dan and Sarah lose 1 life. Ant, Dec, Dan and Sarah are shocked at this answer. Dan and Sarah receive their odd or even lifeline. Dan and Sarah use their odd or even lifeline. Dan and Sarah answer another question. This answer is under. Dan and Sarah lose 10 of their lives. Dan and Sarah cash out for £250,000. Nick and Kajal are introduced. Nick and Kajal answer some quickfire questions. Nick and Kajal receive 15 lives. Nick and Kajal are shown where their lifelines are located. Nick and Kajal answer their first question. This answer is exact. Nick and Kajal bank £2,500. Nick and Kajal now have 20 lives. Nick and Kajal lock in another answer. This answer is under. Nick apologises. Nick and Kajal lose 2 of their lives. Nick and Kajal receive their range lifeline. Nick and Kajal answer another question. Nick and Kajal use their range lifeline. This answer is over and Nick and Kajal leave with nothing. That is my recap of Ant and Dec's Limitless Win, Season 4, Episode 4. So in tomorrow's episode, we are heading back to Neighbours tomorrow, where I will be recapping Neighbours episode 9172. So as I mentioned previously, there isn't a specific episode trailer, but there is the 2025 trailer, which is the most recent trailer for these lots of episodes. There is another trailer that has been released but isn't relevant to this episode, and the episodes that I'm recapping at the moment, and it will be later on, but it kind of spoils a lot of that and makes absolutely no sense. So much in that. So it is the Neighbours 2025 trailer. was the Neighbours 2025 trailer, and I've shown you that because in tomorrow's episode I'll be recapping Neighbours episode 9172. Back to this episode, let me know what you thought of Antodec's Limitless Win season 4 episode 4 if you watched it, my recap. If you didn't, you can put your thoughts on both of those in the comments below, as well with anything else you want to come on the channel, such as any previews or recaps. Put those in the comments below as well. Remember to also like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you in tomorrow's episode where I will be recapping Neighbours episode 9172. Goodbye.